Gentlemen, the hour is upon us.
Indeed. Let us ensure every word reflects our solemn purpose. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
All right, get your notes ready and let S get them brain cows milked, because it is time for Chapter 1, A Nation at a Crossroads. Okay, so before we dive into this chapter, there's a couple concepts you should probably have in mind. First, the ideas of a monarchy and a republic. You already know what a monarchy is, right? Like a king or queen rules, and they get their power from God, or tradition, or something. The opposite of that is a republic, where power is held by the people and their elected representatives. And then there's also the concept of a confederation, which is like a loose alliance between independent states. Now, the word confederation appears in our title, and that S because after winning their independence from Britain, the 13 original states formed something called the Articles of Confederation, which was a governance structure that organized this new country. But as we're going to see in this chapter, the Articles of Confederation had some significant weaknesses. So if you can remember nothing else from this video, please just remember this. The Articles of Confederation were not a fan of a strong central government. Okay, so let's begin. So here in our opening, we've got a painting called The Death of General Wolfe. Now, who's this guy? Well, he was the British general who died during the Battle of Quebec in 1759. Why is it important? Because his death helped Britain lose the 7 Years' War, and that war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which gave America all of this land. And that treaty is like the inciting incident for our story. It marks the beginning of the American story. But now the United States is like an infant nation, and nobody knows what direction things are gone. Now go. Will this be a great experiment in republicanism? Or will it just become another tyrannical government, like the one they just escaped? That's what we're going to spend this chapter talking about. So first off, let's talk about how weak the central government was under the Articles of Confederation. So if you remember from Unit 2, the big fear among the Founding Fathers was a powerful central government. They feared that a powerful central government would become a tyrannical government, like the one they had under King George. So they purposely created a very weak central government. So here's what we've got. The executive branch didn't even have a president, and instead it was run by a committee of the states. What about the judicial branch? They also didn't have a federal court system, and instead they relied on local courts. So basically, the only thing the national government could do was declare war, make treaties, and do stuff like that. They couldn't enforce anything. They couldn't collect taxes. They couldn't regulate commerce. And the states were essentially operating independently. And here's an example of how weak this central government was. So in 1778, Congress asked all the states to send representatives to a Grand Council that would meet in Congress. They wanted this to strengthen the central government. But when it came time for the Congress to meet, only 3 states showed up. Now, despite the weakness of the national government, there were still some significant accomplishments during this period. First of all, we had the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, and that established the process for admitting new states to the Union. It also banned slavery in the Northwest Territory, and that was a huge accomplishment at the time, because slavery was still legal in most states. There was also the Land Ordinance of 1785, which established a system for surveying and selling land in the Northwest Territory. It divided the land into townships and sections and so forth, and sold it off to settlers. This was an important step in the development of the United States, because it provided a way to fund the central government and it encouraged settlement in the Western Territories. The final accomplishment was the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. This was a treaty that ended a conflict between the United States and a coalition of Native American tribes. It resulted in the United States acquiring more land in the Northwest Territory. Now, while those are important accomplishments, the biggest problem with the Articles of Confederation was the fact that the central government couldn't really do anything to solve problems, and this led to all sorts of tensions. So first of all, there were lots of trade disputes among the states. Virginia wanted to tax the goods of merchants who passed through their state, but other states didn't want to do that. So what did merchants do? They found ways around it. They went through other states until they got to where they needed to go. And this constant struggle over trade regulations really irritated everyone. Another source of tension was the issue of war debts. During the Revolutionary War, the central government borrowed money from foreign countries and from people within the country to help pay for the war effort. But after the war, the central government didn't have a way to repay that debt. This meant that individual states had to pay back a lot of the war debts, and they were reluctant to do that. And finally, there was unrest among the common people. Remember, after the war, many soldiers didn't get paid, so they were out of work and angry. Also, there was a recession, and that didn't help things. And so this anger reached a boiling point in 1786, when a group of farmers in western Massachusetts led a rebellion known as Shays' Rebellion. Now, don't get confused about this, because this isn't Shays' army. We're talking about the Whiskey Rebellion from Unit 4. Shays' Rebellion was a separate thing. So Shays' Rebellion started because farmers were getting foreclosed on and sent to debtors' prison. So they rebelled and closed down the courts in western Massachusetts. And that really alarmed people, because here the central government could unstop this rebellion because they didn't have a military. And so wealthy landowners had to put down the rebellion themselves. So that brings us to the conclusion of this chapter, and it ends with a meeting of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. So, obviously something had to be done to fix the problems under the Articles of Confederation. And so, delegates met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. However, the delegates quickly realized that the Articles couldn't be fixed. And so instead they wrote a new constitution, which established a new form of government for the United States. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so let's finish this up with the main ideas of this chapter. So first of all, the central government under the Articles of Confederation was intentionally weak, and this led to several issues, including trade disputes between states, failure to pay off war debts, and finally, unrest and rebellion. Shays' Rebellion demonstrated the weakness of the central government and the need for change. And then finally, these issues led to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which ultimately led to the writing of the US Constitution. Okay, that's what you need to know for this chapter. If you want me to keep making these videos, express your undying love by clicking that subscribe button. Until next time, I'm out. Well, hey there, and welcome back to my channel. And this is Chapter 2 of our American History Crash Course series. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. Okay, so in Chapter 1 we talked about how the Articles of Confederation was the first governing system for the newly independent United States, and how it was basically a disaster. So in this episode we're going to talk about how leaders began to call for a stronger union even under the Articles of Confederation. So at the end of the American Revolution, America's leaders knew that the Articles needed to be fixed. They all understood that the Articles created a weak central government and that it wasn't effectively solving any of the problems that they had as a nation. Now some people wanted to go ahead and totally scrap the Articles and start over with a new governing system. And others argued that it was worth trying to fix the issues under the Articles, maybe through amendments or something like that, before scrapping it and starting over. But what everyone agreed upon was that the Articles needed to be strengthened somehow. Leaders who favored a stronger central government over the weak one created by the Articles of Confederation were known as nationalists. Okay, that's not a term we use too much anymore, but when people are being anti-nationalist, they're usually being nationalist. Anyway, George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton were among the most influential nationalists. Now, we'll focus on Madison and Hamilton in this video, but I want you to know that George Washington was also a strong nationalist. His reputation as a leader and his overwhelming popularity helped to give credibility to calls for a new governing system. In fact, he lent his support to the Annapolis Convention of 1786. This convention was the first step toward drafting a new constitution. The Annapolis Convention was attended by delegates from 6 states, and because so few states showed up, it didn't really accomplish much. It ended up being more of a committee to plan a future meeting. That committee's plan was to hold another convention in Philadelphia in 1787, but in order to get states to show up, they had to kind of be vague about why they were calling for another meeting. So they said that the purpose of the meeting would be to, quote, instruct the people of the United States to take into consideration the situation of our country in a variety of its most important and interesting particulars. Yeah, okay, sure, whatever, come to Philly in 1787. We'll tell you why later. And it worked. 12 states showed up. And if you want to hear about that constitutional convention, where they actually did draft the constitution, well then you're gone. Now I have to wait until next time, because that is gone. Now I'll be in chapter 3. Okay. So now let us focus on James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, because they were the driving forces behind calls for a new governing system. Madison had written extensively about the flaws in the Articles of Confederation during the war years and afterwards. He had been inspired by Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose ideas about popular sovereignty and the social contract were hugely influential on Madison. You can learn more about that in our European history videos, which I will link in the description. Anyway, Rousseau argued that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that the people have a right to alter or abolish a government that does not uphold its end of the bargain. Madison applied these principles to the Articles of Confederation, and he became convinced that the national government could not be fixed. It was too weak, it couldn't even tax, and without revenue the government couldn't do anything. And what's more, the Articles couldn't be amended without the consent of all 13 states, and it just wasn't going to happen. Madison outlined his arguments in a famous essay called The Federalist No. 10, in which he warned that factions would always try to take over the government, and that the best way to prevent that from happening was to create a strong government that was powerful enough to resist factions. Alexander Hamilton took an even harsher stance against the Articles of Confederation than Madison. In a letter to James Duane in 1786, he said that the Articles had created such a weak central government that it had resulted in anarchy. He called the Articles an inadequate and ineffectual system, and argued that the government it created was not merely defective, but that the whole thing needed to be replaced. In Federalist No. 22, Hamilton expanded on these arguments, saying that because the Articles created such a weak central government, each state was essentially a kind of mini-republic within the larger United States, and because they were so similar, it led to competition between states, which resulted in instability and ultimately anarchy. Hamilton argued that the only cure for this was to create a strong central government with significant power over the states. However, despite their disagreements with the Articles of Confederation, both Hamilton and Madison understood that they couldn't just go to the states and say, "Hey guys, this ain't working. Let's replace it with this new thing I wrote." First of all, they needed to convince the public to support a new governing system, and then they needed to convince the states to agree to it. So they started doing what they could to raise awareness about the shortcomings of the Articles and generate public support for a new governing system. Hamilton, for example, had been appointed to serve as a delegate to the Continental Congress after the war, and he used that position to advocate for a new constitution. However, even though he was using the power of the federal government to promote his agenda, he still had to be careful. While most people probably understood that the Articles of Confederation wasn't working, it was still revered as a symbol of independence. So Hamilton tried to tread carefully and avoid coming out too strongly against it. James Madison, meanwhile, wrote several essays anonymously that were published in newspapers throughout the United States. Under the pseudonym Publius, he explained why the Articles of Confederation was failing and how it could be fixed. These essays became known as the Federalist Papers. But while Madison and Hamilton were writing and speaking about how the Articles needed to be fixed, there were people who were quite happy with the way things were. These people were known as Anti-Federalists, and they vehemently opposed the drafting of a new constitution. Now, there were Anti-Federalists who were opposed to a new constitution for various reasons, but the main group was made up of people known as Agrarian Anti-Federalists. The name Agrarian Anti-Federalists comes from the fact that most of the people who opposed the constitution were farmers, and they feared that a strong central government would take away the limited amount of power that they already had. This group was especially strong in rural areas of New England and in the backcountry regions of North Carolina and Virginia, and although they opposed a strong central government, Agrarian Anti-Federalists weren't necessarily pro-Articles of Confederation. Instead, they preferred a decentralized government in which power was held in local hands. They wanted local legislatures to have more power, and they wanted states to have more power over the central government. And since a major part of their economy was trade with Britain, many of them were also wary of tariffs and other restrictions on interstate commerce. So you have the nationalists, who want a stronger central government, the Agrarian Anti-Federalists, who want a weaker central government and more power for the states and the local governments. Who's gonna win? Well, I'm glad you asked. And the answer is no one. Well, actually, I take that back. Someone did win, but it wasn't either of those groups. As it turned out, neither side was able to rally enough support to keep the Articles of Confederation in place. And that's partly because they were fighting each other so much that they weakened each other's agendas. And the biggest beneficiary of this infighting was the Federalists. Now, if you want to learn more about the Constitutional Convention and how the Constitution got ratified, then you're going to have to subscribe and then click right here to keep watching this series. I'll see you there.
Picture this. It's May 1787. The air in Philadelphia is buzzing with anticipation. Spring is in full swing, but it's not just the weather that's heating up. A gathering is taking place that will forever change the course of a young nation. Welcome back to our series on the founding of America. Today, we're diving into Chapter 3, The Gathering in Philadelphia. After the struggles of the Articles of Confederation, it was clear something had to be done. The best and brightest minds from across the 13 states were called to Philadelphia to the very same room where the Declaration of Independence had been signed just 11 years earlier, the Pennsylvania State House, now known to all of us as Independence Hall. Imagine walking into that room. The weight of history, the gravity of the moment, it must have been palpable. The delegates, 55 in total, trickled in, not all at once, but with a shared sense of urgency. They weren't just there to tweak a few laws. They were there to build a government from the ground up. So, who was in the room? Let's do a quick roll call of the heavy hitters. First, you have the man who many considered the father of the Constitution, James Madison. He arrived early, armed with a plan and years of research into governments throughout history. He wasn't just showing up. He was showing up prepared to lead the intellectual charge. His detailed notes from the convention are the main reason we know so much about what happened behind those closed doors. Then, there was the elder statesman, the wise old sage of the Revolution, Benjamin Franklin. At 81 years old, he was the oldest delegate, often in poor health, but his mind was as sharp as ever. His presence alone lent an air of gravity and wisdom to the proceedings. He was the calming influence, the voice of compromise when tempers flared. His wit and diplomatic skill were invaluable in bridging the divides between the states. And of course, you can't talk about this gathering without mentioning the one man everyone looked up to, literally and figuratively, George Washington. His attendance was crucial. After leading the Continental Army to victory, he had hoped for a quiet retirement at Mount Vernon. But his country called again. Reluctantly, he agreed to attend and was unanimously elected as the convention's president. His stoic, dignified presence in the presiding chair gave the assembly a legitimacy it otherwise would have lacked. Just him being there signaled to the world that this was serious business. Let's not forget the ambitious and brilliant Alexander Hamilton from New York, a passionate advocate for a strong, centralized government. Hamilton was never one to shy away from a debate. He was young, energetic, and had a bold vision for America's economic and political future. While some of his more radical ideas were initially rejected, his influence was undeniable, and he would later become a key champion for the Constitution's ratification. These four men, Madison, Franklin, Washington, and Hamilton, formed a powerhouse of intellect, experience, and leadership. But just as important as who was there is who wasn't. Two of the most famous names from the Revolution were conspicuously absent. Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, was thousands of miles away, serving as the U.S. minister to France. He followed the proceedings with great interest through letters, famously referring to the delegates as an assembly of demigods. But his direct voice was missing from the debates. Similarly, John Adams, another key figure in the fight for independence, was on diplomatic duty in Great Britain. As the U.S. minister to the court of St. James's, he was busy navigating the tense post-war relationship with the former colonial ruler. Like Jefferson, he corresponded from afar, offering his thoughts and insights. But he couldn't participate in the day-to-day arguments and compromises that shaped the final document. The absence of these two giants meant that the conversation in Philadelphia took a different shape than it might have otherwise. So the stage was set. The delegates had gathered, a mix of seasoned veterans and ambitious newcomers. They came from different states, with different interests, and different ideas about what this new government should look like. Some wanted a powerful national government, while others feared it would trample on the rights of the states. The task before them was monumental: to create a system of government that could unite a diverse people, protect their liberties, and endure for generations. The doors of Independence Hall were closed to the public and the press. The windows were nailed shut to ensure secrecy, even in the sweltering summer heat. What happened inside that room was a secret, a 4-month-long debate that was heated, passionate, and at times seemed on the brink of collapse. They argued over representation, slavery, the power of the executive, and the rights of individuals. It was a pressure cooker of ideas and ideologies. This wasn't a simple meeting. It was a battle of wills and philosophies. The delegates knew they were not just drafting a document. They were laying the foundation for a nation. Every clause, every sentence was scrutinized and debated. The easy path would have been to give up, to let the fragile union dissolve. But they didn't. They stayed. They argued. They compromised. And they ultimately created one of the most remarkable documents in human history. The gathering in Philadelphia was more than just a historical event. It was a testament to the power of dialogue, compromise, and shared purpose. It's a story of how a group of imperfect people, in an imperfect time, came together to strive for a more perfect union. And that's a story that still resonates with us today. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into America's past. I hope you found this chapter as fascinating as I do. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter, where we'll dive into the major debates of the convention. We'd love to have you with us. Until next time, stay curious.
Chapter 4. Washington takes the chair. All right, now let's get into Chapter 4 of our American government textbook. In this chapter, we're going to learn about the legislative branch of the federal government, specifically how the people who make up the legislative branch were chosen. Talk about what powers the Constitution gives to Congress, and then finally, how Congress actually goes about making laws. So, if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so before we can talk about how Congress works, we have to first learn about how the members of Congress are actually chosen. And the story starts in Philadelphia in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention. It is May, and the delegates from all the states are gathered together, trying to figure out how they should structure this new government that they're recreating. One of their first big decisions was who should preside over this meeting. Well, after some discussion, they decided unanimously to choose George Washington to be president of the convention. Why did they choose him? Well, for one, he was a symbol of unity between the northern and southern states. He was also a symbol of unity between the large and small states because he didn't come from either of those groups. And most importantly, he was a symbol of trust. The delegates believed that he would remain impartial or unbiased to the issue of representation in Congress, which was causing a lot of debate at the time. In other words, if they couldn't agree on who should run the convention, they went with the person that everyone agreed on. Everyone respected George Washington, and no one could accuse him of being biased toward any particular group. And so the document says, the choice was so evident that it was carried without a vote. Now, whether or not Washington actually presided over the convention impartially is a whole other story that you can read about in your book. But that's neither here nor there for our purposes. What's important is that Washington was the symbol of impartiality, and that's why he was chosen. Now, once Washington took the chair, the convention began its work, which included hammering out the details of how the legislative branch of the new federal government would work. And in order to understand how they decided to structure the legislative branch, let us review real quick the principles of power that we talked about in Chapter 2. Remember that we said that in order for a government to be effective, it must have three: authority, which is the power to make laws; responsibility, which is the obligation to enforce those laws; and limited government, which is the idea that the government doesn't have absolute power, but rather only the power that the people choose to delegate to it. Now, according to the principle of separation of powers, these three principles of government, authority, responsibility, and limited government, had to be separated between the three branches of the new federal government. And so far, we've established that the executive branch will be responsible for enforcing the laws of the government. But where does that leave the other two principles? Well, let's start with authority. Where will the power to make laws come from? Well, according to the principle of popular sovereignty, the power to make laws ultimately comes from the people. That means that, in a republic like the United States, the people are the source of any and all governmental authority, and so, in order to exercise that authority, the people must delegate it to someone, in this case, to their representatives in the legislative branch. So we know that the legislative branch will be responsible for making laws. But what about limited government? How can we ensure that the legislative branch doesn't become a tyrannical law-making body that tramples the rights of the people? Well, in order to limit the power of the legislative branch, the framers created a system of checks and balances. And one way that the legislative branch would be checked was through representation in the House of Representatives. Which brings us to another key event in the story, the Connecticut Compromise. This compromise resolved the debate over representation in Congress between the large states and the small states. As I've told you before, the large states wanted representation based on population, while the small states wanted equal representation regardless of population. And the Connecticut Compromise solved this problem by giving each state to senators, guaranteeing equal representation, and then basing representation in the House of Representatives on population. Now, to fully explain the Connecticut Compromise and why it was such a big deal, I'm going to need a few more videos, so stay tuned. But for now, just know that the result of this compromise was a bicameral legislature, meaning that Congress would be composed of two houses or chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. And so now we have all three principles of effective government delegated to the three branches of the new federal government. The executive branch, which would enforce the laws, gets its power directly from the people through the process of popular sovereignty. The legislative branch, which writes the laws, gets its power from the people through their elected representatives. And finally, the judicial branch, which will be responsible for interpreting the laws, also gets its power from the people. In other words, the ultimate source of power in this new government would be the people. Now, as far as the day-to-day operations of Congress, Article 1 of the Constitution gives us some details. First, it establishes the qualifications for members of Congress. To be a senator, you have to be at least 30 years old, have been a citizen of the United States for at least 9 years, and have been a resident of the state you wish to represent for at least 6 years. To be a representative, you just have to be at least 25 years old, a citizen for at least 7 years, and a resident of the district you wish to represent. Second, Article 1 establishes the length of their terms. Senators serve 6-year terms, and representatives serve 2-year terms. These terms are staggered so that every 2 years a bunch of congressional seats are up for election at the same time. That way, voters don't have the opportunity to completely overturn the government every 2 years. Third, Article 1 establishes the basic process by which laws are made. A bill, which is the official term for a proposed law, can be introduced by any member of Congress. After it's introduced, the bill goes to a committee, where it's either approved, amended, or killed. If it's amended, it goes to the full chamber for a vote. If it passes in one chamber, it moves to the other chamber, where it's considered by a different committee. And if approved by that committee, it goes to the full chamber for a vote. If it passes there, it moves on to the president for his approval. If he approves, it becomes a law. If he vetoes it, the bill can still pass into law if 2/3 of both houses of Congress approve of it. And finally, if the president doesn't respond to a bill within 10 days, it automatically becomes a law unless it's an absolute emergency. In that case, the Speaker of the House can advance the bill without the president's approval. Now again, this is a very simplified explanation of the lawmaking process. So for more information, please refer to your textbook. Okay, click here if you need help with any of the other chapters in this book, or click here to keep reviewing for Unit 1. And finally, I'm pretty sure that if you're watching this video, your teacher probably assigned it to you, so you might as well just go ahead and click here and let them know that you finished this assignment. Anyway, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop-heimer out.
All right. Get your note-taking fingers ready and your brain cells preserved in formaldehyde because it is time to learn about Chapter 5. Madison S. Big plan, you know what? Hold on. Before we dive into this chapter, let me explain something. I'm not really good at this whole educational YouTube thing yet. So if you're watching this and you're like, why is he talking to me like I'm his mom? Well, that's because I am. Yep, I'm a first-time father to an absolutely adorable baby boy. And I realize that explaining things to him is going to be part of my life for the next 18 years. Plus, there are some perks, like someone to blame when the toilet overflows or the dog hair starts to pile up. Anyways, wish me luck, and now let's get back to learning about Chapter 5. Okay, so Chapter 5 of our textbook begins with a big, how should the new nation be organized? We last saw James Madison at the Constitutional Convention, where he was one of the most influential delegates. But even he admitted that the Virginia Plan, which he wrote, was dead on arrival. Why? Because its main provision, representation based on population, would punish smaller states while benefiting larger states like Virginia, and smaller states like New Jersey weren't having it. But Madison didn't want to give up his big plan just yet. So instead of giving the plan his name, he decided to tinker with it a bit, and in order to appease the smaller states, he proposed a new plan, hence the title of this chapter. And before we get into exactly what this plan entailed, let's spend some time thinking like historians. Think about why state legislatures were opposed to a strong central government in the first place. What kind of power would that take away from them? Well, think about it. If there were 3 branches of a central government, then wouldn't that mean that the power of the purse, meaning the power to tax, would rest with the national government rather than the state government? Yep, that's right. And the point of the tax was to raise money to support the national government, thus giving the central government more power. But okay, you might be saying, wait a minute. Doesn't that violate the whole principle of representative government? And you're absolutely correct. Representative government only works if the representatives are actually representing the people. And if the central government is taking power away from the states, then isn't it taking power away from the people? Well, yes, it is. And that is exactly why this provision of Madison's plan stirred up such controversy. So now let's dive into what this plan actually entailed. First off, like the Virginia Plan, it established a system of 3 branches of government. Now remember that the framers believed that a pure democracy would lead to mob rule, and since they wanted to protect the interests of the elite few from the masses, they created a representative republic. The people would elect representatives to make laws on their behalf, and then those laws would be executed or enforced by an executive branch headed by a president. And finally, there would be a judicial branch to interpret whether those laws passed by the legislative branch were indeed constitutional. Now second, the plan called for a bicameral legislature, which means a legislature divided into 2 houses. The lower house would be based on population, and therefore would represent the interests of larger states, and the upper house, which would have each state represented equally, would represent the interests of smaller states. Now this was a clever way of appeasing both larger states and smaller states. Each state gets a certain amount of representation regardless of size, and this is why the Senate is known as the equal or upper chamber. At the same time, the lower chamber would have representation based on population, which appeased the larger states. This is why the House of Representatives is known as the lower chamber. Finally, the executive and the judicial branches would be independent of the legislature. In other words, the president would not be chosen by the legislature, and judges would be appointed in such a way that they could decide cases without worrying about offending the legislature. Now, do you remember how I said that the Virginia Plan was dead on arrival because it gave too much power to the larger states? Well, the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, resolved this issue and breathed new life into Madison's plan. In fact, it's the foundation on which the entire Constitution is built. So let's review the deadlock at the convention. The large states supported the Virginia Plan, which called for proportional representation in Congress. However, the small states preferred the New Jersey Plan, which provided equal representation for all states regardless of size. Both plans had strengths and weaknesses, and neither side would budge. The convention appeared to be at an impasse. Then enter Roger Sherman, a delegate from Connecticut. He proposed a compromise that combined the ideas of the 2 plans. This resulted in a bicameral legislature with the Senate representing states equally and the House of Representatives representing states proportionally. This resolution broke the deadlock and allowed the convention to move forward. The remaining debate centered around slavery. Some southern states wanted to count slaves as property to increase their representation. Others argued that slavery was morally repugnant and should not receive any recognition in the Constitution. After much discussion and negotiation, it was decided that each slave would count as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation and taxation. This compromise, known as The 3/5 compromise allowed for the continuation of slavery while providing a way to count enslaved people for political representation and taxation. All right, now that we've gotten the basics down, let's try to really understand this chapter. Okay, so how did Madison's plan resolve the issues facing the framers? Well, let's break this down. First, regarding representation, Madison's plan resolved the deadlock between large and small states by creating a bicameral legislature with the Senate, providing equal representation for states, and the House of Representatives, providing proportional representation based on population. Second, the plan addressed the issue of slavery by counting each slave as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation, thus allowing for the continuation of slavery while still providing a way to include enslaved people in the political system. No. Tiered. Madison's plan also established a system of checks and balances among the three branches of government, ensuring that no one branch would become too powerful. Finally, the plan created a strong central government with a national legislature, executive and judicial branch, which resolved the issue of whether the new government should be weak or strong. Okay, now let's finish by considering why this chapter matters. It matters because Madison's plan, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, formed the basis for the Great Compromise at the Constitutional Convention. Without this compromise, the convention would not have been able to resolve the major issues of representation, slavery, and the balance of power between the federal and state governments. As a result, the United States would not have been able to establish a stable and lasting government under the Constitution. Okay, now let's finish by considering why this chapter matters. It matters because Madison's plan, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, formed the basis for the Great Compromise at the Constitutional Convention. Without this compromise, the convention would not have been able to resolve the major issues of representation, slavery, and the balance of power between the federal and state governments. As a result, the United States would not have been able to establish a stable and lasting government under the Constitution. Finally, here are some additional terms you need to know from this chapter. First, the separation of powers is a system in which the powers of government are divided among separate branches, with the purpose of preventing any one branch from becoming too powerful. Second, the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, resolved the issue of representation at the Constitutional Convention by establishing a bicameral legislature, with the Senate representing states equally and the House of Representatives representing states proportionally. And third, the 3/5 Compromise resolved the issue of slavery by counting each slave as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and taxation. Alright, that is what you need to know about Chapter 5. Click here to keep reviewing for Unit 2, and click here for a review packet that will help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. Alright, Chapter 6, The Great Debate Over Representation. Let's do this. Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to see how the issue of representation almost wrecked the Constitutional Convention. So let's imagine that you are an American colonist. You have just come from a meeting with your state's representatives to discuss the possibility of creating a new government for our nation. As a large landowner in your state, you have great influence over your state's delegates, and thus you get to set their position on issues related to representation. Since your state has a lot of people living in it, you think that it is very important that this new government is representative of the people. In other words, you believe that states like Virginia, which have many people living in them, should have more voice in the new central government than smaller states like New Jersey. What could possibly go wrong? Well, first of all, let me introduce you to Roger Sherman. Sherman was one of the delegates from Connecticut, a medium-sized state, and he was horrified at the proposal put forth by James Madison and the Virginia delegation. Madison's plan gave more representation to states with larger populations, but Sherman believed that such a plan would trample the interests of smaller states like his own. Sherman argued that if big states had more representation, then they would be able to bully the little guys. And what's to stop them from doing that? Well, nothing except our good nature, says Sherman. But why should we assume that the big states will be our benevolent overlords? Sherman didn't think we should make that assumption. Now, you probably know where this debate is going. The issue of representation was one of the biggest issues facing the Constitutional Convention. And in this video, we're going to see how this issue almost killed the convention. Okay, now back to our story. The issue of representation dominated the debates in the Constitutional Convention, and it can be broken down into two competing plans. The first was the Virginia Plan, and the second was the New Jersey Plan. And as their names indicate, these plans were put forth by the states of Virginia and New Jersey. Now, we've already discussed the Virginia Plan. It was put forth by James Madison, and it called for proportional representation in the national legislature. That meant that states with larger populations would get more representatives. So what was the New Jersey Plan? Well, the New Jersey Plan was put forth by William Paterson, who was a delegate from New Jersey, and it was based on the New Jersey Constitution, which provided 4 equal votes for each state regardless of population. So under the New Jersey Plan, a state like California would have the exact same amount of voting power in the legislature as a tiny state like New Hampshire. Now, the main argument for the New Jersey Plan was that it would protect the interests of the smaller states. Under the Virginia Plan, these states would be completely overshadowed by the big states. But under the New Jersey Plan, each state would have 1 vote, and therefore each state would be equally represented. However, the New Jersey Plan was not without its weaknesses. For example, it did not take into consideration the differences in wealth among the various states. Texas might have fewer people than New York, but most folks would agree that Texas is wealthier. In addition, some folks, namely James Madison, argued that the New Jersey Plan would violate the basic principle of republicanism, which holds that the government gets its legitimacy from the people. If the New Jersey Plan were adopted, then many Americans would not be equally represented since the large states had so many more people than the small states. Therefore, the large states argued, the New Jersey Plan was undemocratic. Now, both of these plans had their pros and cons. The question was, which one would the delegates adopt? Well, before we get into the debate, let me remind you that the convention was dominated by the large states. There were 7 large states and 4 small states. In addition, the large states were wealthier and had more representation at the convention. The small states only had 17 delegates, while the large states had 52. Also, the southern states, which were mostly large states, controlled the presidency and the Supreme Court. All this is to say that the large states were in a position to dominate the convention and impose the Virginia Plan on everyone else. However, the small states threatened to walk out of the convention unless their interests were protected. They knew that if they walked out, then the convention would end, and there would be no new constitution. The large states would have to settle for the Articles of Confederation. This presented a dilemma for the large states. On the one hand, they wanted to impose the Virginia Plan on the convention. But if they pushed too hard, then the convention would fail, and there would be no new constitution. In order to find a compromise, let's look at how the debate went down. First off, it was a classic debate between 2 plans. The large states championed the Virginia Plan, and the small states supported the New Jersey Plan. The first point of contention was over-representation in the national legislature. The Virginia Plan called for proportional representation, meaning that states with more people would get more representation. The New Jersey Plan called for equal representation, meaning that each state would have the same amount of representation regardless of its population. The small states feared that the Virginia Plan would allow the large states to bully them around in the legislature, so they dug in their heels and refused to budge on this issue. Next, the delegates had to decide how to elect the president. Under the Virginia Plan, the president would be elected by the national legislature. This meant that the large states would have more influence over the presidency than the small states. The New Jersey Plan left the method of electing the president up to state legislatures. This meant that the small states would have an equal say in electing the president as the large states. Finally, the delegates had to decide how to structure the national government. The Virginia Plan called for a strong central government with 3 separate branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The New Jersey Plan called for a weak central government with a single branch. As the debate raged on, it became clear that neither side was willing to compromise. The large states were unwilling to give the small states equal representation in the legislature, and the small states were unwilling to give up their equal votes. The deadlock seemed to be so complete that many delegates began to think that the convention would fail. However, on June, a Connecticut delegate named Roger Sherman came up with a compromise that broke the deadlock. Sherman proposed what has become known as the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise resolved the issue of representation by combining the 2 plans. Representation in the House of Representatives would be based on population, giving the large states more power. Representation in the Senate would be equal, giving the small states more power. This compromise broke the deadlock and allowed the convention to continue. Now, I want to take a moment to address a misconception about the Connecticut Compromise. Many people believe that this compromise gave the South an unfair advantage in the Senate because it gave each state to senators regardless of population. However, this is not true. While it is true that the South benefited from the Connecticut Compromise, this was not because of population. The South benefited from the Connecticut Compromise because it guaranteed that they would have 2 senators, regardless of whether or not slavery was included in the census. Article 14 of the Constitution allows states to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. This meant that the South would be able to claim the population of their slaves in order to increase their representation in the House. However, Article 14 did not apply to the Senate because representation in the Senate was equal. This meant that the South could not increase their representation in the Senate by counting slaves as part of their population. Therefore, the statement that the Connecticut Compromise gave the South an unfair advantage in the Senate is simply false. Okay, now let's see how the delegates voted on the final plan. In the House, representation was based on population. This meant that the large states were well represented. In the Senate, each state got 2 representatives. This meant that the small states were well represented. Okay, now the delegates had to decide whether or not to ratify the plan. The small states threatened to walk out of the convention unless the plan was ratified. They knew that if they walked out, then the convention would fail and there would be no new constitution. The large states realized that they needed the support of the small states in order to ratify the plan, so they agreed to accept the plan as it was. On July, the delegates voted on the plan. The large states voted in favor, and the small states voted against. But since the large states had more representatives, the plan was accepted. Now let's think about why this compromise worked. The Connecticut Compromise was able to resolve the deadlock over representation by giving each side what they wanted. The large states got proportional representation in the House, and the small states got equal representation in the Senate. In addition, the compromise allowed the convention to continue and ultimately led to the creation of the United States Constitution. However, the Connecticut Compromise also had some negative consequences. First, it created a 2-tiered system of representation. The large states got more representation in the House, and the small states got more representation in the Senate. This meant that no state was equally represented. Second, the compromise did not take into account the issue of slavery. The South was able to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in the House. This gave the South more representation than they would have otherwise received and allowed them to maintain control over the institution of slavery. Finally, the compromise did not solve the issue of taxation. The Constitution does not say how taxes should be levied, and this issue would cause problems in the future. But for now, the Connecticut Compromise was able to resolve the deadlock over representation and allow the convention to continue. Okay, let's finish this up. In this video, we learned that the issue of representation almost wrecked the Constitutional Convention. The debate over representation was between the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. The Virginia Plan called for proportional representation, and the New Jersey Plan called for equal representation. The debate was eventually resolved with the Connecticut Compromise, which provided for proportional representation in the House and equal representation in the Senate. While the compromise was successful in resolving the deadlock, it also created a 2-tiered system of representation and did not take into account the issue of slavery. Nevertheless, the compromise was an important step towards the creation of the United States Constitution. Okay, that's what we're going to do for this video. I hope that you learned something. If you did, please subscribe. And if you want me to keep making these videos, then please like them. And if you want to watch the next video in the series, then click right here. I'll see you there.
All right, get your notes ready because it's time for Chapter 7 of the AP Government Curriculum. Now this chapter is all about one of the most important compromises in the Constitutional Convention, the Great Compromise. So if you have your notes ready, let's get to it. Okay, so before we dive into the Great Compromise, you need to know that there was a big debate happening over representation. And we've been talking about this since Unit 2. Remember, the Virginia Plan called for representation based on population, and the New Jersey Plan called for equal representation among the states, and neither side would budge. But don't worry, because Roger Sherman from Connecticut saved the day with his Great Compromise. Now, you should know that he didn't call it the Great Compromise. That's just what historians call it. But regardless, his plan did resolve the issue of representation, and it did save the convention from collapse. So let's see how he did it. Okay, so first of all, let me explain why this issue was so contentious. Large states wanted representation based on population, because that meant they would have more representatives and therefore more power in Congress. Smaller states wanted equal representation, because that meant that they wouldn't be overshadowed by those larger states. Without a compromise on this issue, there would be no constitution. So let's see how Sherman and his allies resolved this issue. First of all, Sherman's plan was also known as the Connecticut Compromise, because he represented Connecticut. But aside from being a title, the compromise had two parts. One part dealt with the issue of representation in Congress, and the other dealt with representation in the executive branch. Let's start with Congress. Sherman's compromise created what is called a bicameral Congress, which means that there are two houses or chambers in the legislative branch. Now these two houses are the Senate and the House of Representatives. In the Senate, every state gets equal representation. So states with large populations like California and Texas get the same amount of senators as states with small populations like Wyoming and Vermont. And that means that each state, regardless of size, has 2 senators. Now that doesn't mean that large states aren't better represented overall, because they have more representatives in the House of Representatives. In order to figure out how many representatives each state would get, the framers decided to count the population of each state and then divide it by 40,000. Then each state would have that number of representatives. Now, why 40,000? Well, at the time there were about 4 million people living in the United States, and 40,000 seemed like a good number to have each representative serve about 1,000 constituents. Now that means that states with more people would have more representatives. So this part of the compromise favored larger states. Now, to review, the Senate represents states equally, and the House of Representatives represents population. And this is so important to remember, because whenever an issue comes before Congress, if it's a matter that favors the larger states, it will likely pass in the House. But if it's a matter that favors the smaller states, it will likely pass in the Senate. And that means that each house acts as a check on the other. Like imagine that the House passes a bill that benefits larger states, like maybe additional funding for public schools. Well, then the Senate won't pass the bill because it doesn't represent the smaller states. Or imagine that the Senate passes a bill that helps smaller states, like a mandate that all states must have 2 senators. Well, then the House won't pass it because that doesn't represent the larger states. But now we have to talk about the other part of the Connecticut Compromise, which had to do with representation in the executive branch. So here's what you need to know. Article 1 of the Constitution establishes the legislative branch. Article 2 establishes the executive branch. And Article 3 establishes the judicial branch. Now, within Article 2, it says that the President will be elected by the Electoral College. Now, what is the Electoral College? Well, it's a body that's indirectly elected by the people. So when you vote for President, you're actually voting for electors, who then vote for the President. Now, each state gets as many electors as it has representatives in Congress. So a state like California, which has a lot of representatives, gets a lot of electors. And a state like Vermont, which has few representatives, gets fewer electors. So, to recap, according to the Constitution, states get 2 senators, regardless of population. They get representatives in the House based on population, and they get electors in the Electoral College based on their representatives in Congress, which is based on population. And now you need to know that this compromise between representation in the Senate and representation in the House of Representatives was a major reason why the convention was able to continue and eventually produce the Constitution. But even though the compromise was forged between delegates from Connecticut, it wasn't exactly popular in Connecticut. Now you need to know that during the Constitutional Convention, James Wilson from Pennsylvania argued against the Connecticut Compromise. He said that since all the states had agreed to give up their individual sovereignty in order to join the Union, it only made sense for them to be equally sovereign in that new federal union. In other words, having equal representation in the Senate made sense because all the states were equal in the Union. Additionally, he argued that since the people were the ultimate source of political power, they should be the ones who determine the amount of representation each state gets. and Wilson thought that this was not the case under the Connecticut Compromise. Now, while Wilson's argument was persuasive, it ultimately didn't sway Connecticut delegates from their position, and in the end, the Connecticut Compromise was adopted. Okay, now let us finish our discussion by talking about how the Great Compromise resolved the issue of representation in the executive branch. As I mentioned earlier, the executive branch is established in Article 2 of the Constitution, and it says that the president will be elected by the Electoral College. Now, the framers could have easily given states a certain number of electors based on their population. After all, that's how the number of representatives is figured out. But instead, the framers decided to give each state 2 electors plus 1 elector for every representative that the state had. So a state like California, which has 52 representatives, would have 54 electors. A state like Vermont, which has 1 representative, would have 3 electors. Now, the reason the framers went with this method, instead of just giving states a number of electors based on population, is that they feared that otherwise there would be too much representation from the larger states. For example, if California had 54 electors and Vermont had 3, well then California could essentially choose the president all by itself. So in order to prevent that from happening, the framers created the Electoral College so that even if your state is small, your vote still counts. And because of that, presidential candidates have to campaign across the entire country and not just focus on the largest states like California and New York. Okay, click right here to grab a review packet if you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And additionally, if you want me to keep making these videos, well then by all means subscribe and I shall oblige. I'm out. Well, now we come to chapter 8, which is called Counting People, Counting Power, and it's about population and representation and taxes. But mainly, let's just say it's about slavery. So in order for representation to be fair, everyone agreed that population, the number of people you have living in your state, would determine how much representation you got. The more people you had, the more representatives you got. But there was a huge disagreement on whether enslaved people should be counted as people. Southern states wanted them counted because they wanted more representation. But northern states said no way. Why not? Well, remember, in the North, slavery had been on the decline for decades. In fact, by 1800, there were only about 2,000 enslaved people left in the whole of New England, whereas in the South, it was still a way of life. They had thousands upon thousands of enslaved people working their fields, and they relied on this unpaid labor to produce crops like tobacco and cotton and rice that were then shipped around the world and brought in loads of money. Not to mention that if you were counting people in the South, you were also counting property. I mean, each person was worth between $20,000 and $40,000, depending on their age and sex and health. So the South wanted these people to count in order to get more representation and avoid paying higher taxes. Meanwhile, the northern states said absolutely not. After all, they'd already abolished slavery, and some of them even said, hey, we don't think Africans should be enslaved at all. And besides, most of them didn't really depend on enslaved labor for their economy. They didn't have as many enslaved people. They weren't shipping as many goods out of their states, so they didn't feel that they were losing anything by not counting these people. Okay, so this was a major issue. And remember, in order for the Constitution to work, everyone had to agree to it. And this group was deeply divided on this issue, and so it threatened to derail the whole convention. But then came a compromise. You see, when the framers met in Philadelphia in 1787, there was an unspoken rule. No one could leave until they had a constitution to show for it, so they were pretty desperate. And what ultimately happened is that they agreed to count 3 out of every 5 enslaved people in determining a state's population. This became known as the 3/5 Compromise. Now, that's obviously not the same thing as saying every human life has value, but it was a painful compromise. It showed just how divided the framers were over slavery. And remember, this wasn't just a random rule they pulled out of a hat. No, this was based on something called the 3/5 rule, which said that enslaved people should count as 3/5 of a person. So for example, if an enslaved person had $100 worth of property, they would only count as $60 when figuring out how much tax you had to pay or how much representation you were entitled to. Now, you might be wondering, why 3/5? What's the deal with that? And the answer is, we don't know. The rule was used during the American Revolution, but no one knows who started it or why they chose that number. But whatever the reason, it actually made sense to the framers at the time. After all, they had been using the 3/5 rule for years. It was well established, and even though it was based on a false assumption that African Americans were less than full human beings, it did acknowledge that these people were indeed human. They were property, yes, but they were still human property. And when you consider the alternatives, this wasn't such a bad deal for the North. After all, they wanted nothing to do with slavery. And while it did pain them to admit that these people were property, they knew that if they didn't compromise, there wouldn't be any compromise. There wouldn't be a constitution. And then what would happen to all of those poor deluded Southerners, with their fancy ideas of states' rights and nullification? Oh, and here's a little tidbit. When it comes to representation in Congress, this rule didn't just affect the South. States like Georgia and South Carolina and Virginia and North Carolina and Delaware and Maryland benefited from counting enslaved people toward representation. That's why you'll often hear people saying that these southern states had disproportionate power in Congress. But it wasn't just the South. For example, in 1800, the Western Territory, which would eventually become the state of Ohio, had 2,000 enslaved people, and they counted for representation too. The 3/5 Compromise gave Northwestern Territory one representative in the House of Representatives. But that doesn't mean that everyone was happy with this compromise. Many abolitionists saw the 3/5 Compromise as immoral. They felt that it was wrong to count enslaved people as property, and they especially hated the idea that the government was actively helping the South maintain slavery by allowing them to count their enslaved people toward representation and taxation. Okay, now let's get back to our regularly scheduled program. Grievances against the king aside, the framers had managed to draft a plan for a new government. They created a constitution that provided for a strong central government, with a president and a two-house legislature, which would make laws that everyone in the country had to follow. It replaced the Articles of Confederation with a system of checks and balances that was designed to prevent tyranny. But once they finished their work in Philadelphia, they had to get the rest of the country to agree to it, and that was going to be tough. First of all, nobody could sign the Constitution until delegates from all 13 states signed it. And second, after that, they needed approval from 9 states in order for it to go into effect. Now, remember, the Constitutional Convention was secret. Nobody could have known what was going on inside that room. So in order to get other states to agree to this new constitution, the framers had to convince people that it was awesome. They needed to convince them that this new plan for a central government wasn't tyrannical. And they accomplished that by promising some major changes. For example, the word slavery doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution, but the framers did agree to a couple things that were pretty anti-slavery. For example, they agreed not to interfere with the institution of slavery in states where it already existed. But they also agreed to ban the importation of new slaves after 1808, which would effectively end slavery in America. Right. Like if you can't bring in any more slaves, then eventually the ones that are currently here will die off, and there won't be any more. The framers also agreed to a fugitive slave clause, which meant that if an enslaved person escaped from the South to the North, then the government would help catch them and return them to their owners. So yeah, the framers knew that slavery was wrong. Obviously, that's why they got rid of it in the Constitution, except that they didn't. Slavery is still legal. In fact, when it came to slavery, the Constitution didn't abolish it. It protected it, and to make matters worse, the Fugitive Slave Clause would be used to justify the return of literally hundreds of thousands of escaped slaves to the South. So, yeah, that was a bit awkward. Still, the framers had good intentions. They knew that the institution of slavery was evil, but they also knew that abolishing it would lead to a civil war. And frankly, they were done fighting wars. They'd just gotten done fighting the Revolutionary War. They didn't want another war. And so they hoped that by avoiding the issue, it would just go away. But it didn't. It grew and grew and grew, until finally, in 1865, the United States would fight a civil war over it and end slavery once and for all. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 3, and I'll see you there.
The delegates at the Constitutional Convention had to decide how to deal with one of the most fundamental aspects of the new government they were creating. How should the executive branch be structured? They knew that if they created a monarchy, they'd be no better off than they were under King George, so they couldn't go in that direction. But they also knew that without a strong executive, the country might descend into chaos. So how did they balance these two fears? Well, let's find out in this, the 17th episode of our crash course on the U.S. Constitution. Okay, so let's start with where we left off. The main thing the Founding Fathers had to do while drafting the Constitution was figure out how to create a representative republic that would protect individual liberty. And so far, they had successfully established that the national government would have three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, which would operate independently from each other in order to keep any one of them from becoming too powerful. But now they had to figure out what the structure of each branch would look like. And in this episode, we're going to focus on the executive branch, or in other words, the presidency. And to tell the story of how the presidency was created, let's begin with the question: what were the competing visions about what the executive branch should be? Well, one of the biggest issues the framers had to deal with was the fear of kingship. Obviously, they didn't want to simply copy the British system where the king had tremendous power and could rule arbitrarily over the people. And even though there was no desire among the framers to establish an absolute democracy where the masses had unchecked power, they also didn't want the executive branch to be too powerful either, lest it become another monarchy in disguise. So first, the delegates had to decide whether they wanted a single president or several. And the answer, at least initially, was kind of obvious. Even though many of the framers favored a plural executive, believing it would make the office more efficient and less prone to tyranny, they knew that such a system wouldn't work in the United States. For one thing, setting up a multi-person executive would require them to divide power among the executive officers, which would almost certainly lead to gridlock. And besides, they feared that a group of people acting as executives would inevitably end up acting like a cabal, and that's not exactly what they were trying to do. On the other hand, having a single executive would concentrate power in one person, something that all the framers had just recently been arguing against when it came to the legislative branch. And indeed, James Madison argued in Federalist 51 that if the will of the people is the ultimate source of the government's power, then concentrating that power in a single executive would invite a tyrannical government. But here's the thing. Although the framers had all signed the agreement to overthrow the monarchy in Britain, their vision of republicanism differed somewhat from the prevailing view today. You see, in modern times, we think of republics as being synonymous with democracies. We use the two terms interchangeably. But in the 18th century, a republic wasn't necessarily synonymous with democracy. In fact, the framers clearly didn't think it was. As far as they were concerned, a republic was a representative form of government. In other words, a republic was a government in which the people held power but exercised it indirectly through elected representatives. A democracy, on the other hand, was a system in which the people voted directly on laws rather than leaving it up to representatives. And the framers weren't big fans of pure democracy because they believed it would lead to mob rule. In fact, the framers generally believed that the majority of people were ill-equipped to make good decisions, especially when it came to matters of public policy. As John Adams put it, a democracy is like a pair of scissors. It cuts both ways. In other words, just as the democratic ideal of majority rule could threaten individual liberty, so could a highly centralized executive branch. So the framers had to come up with a way to balance the need for strong executive leadership with the fear of centralized power. And they accomplished this by creating the office of the president and the electoral college. But before we get into how those institutions work, let's take a brief intermission. Okay, so to resolve the issue of how to balance the need for a strong executive branch with the fear of centralized power, the framers decided to create a single president who would be elected indirectly by the people through a body called the Electoral College. And that seemed like a pretty good compromise to everyone at the time except for a few. For example, James Monroe believed the Electoral College was unconstitutional, since the Constitution doesn't explicitly mention it. But his argument didn't gain any traction at the convention, and for two main reasons. First, the framers thought the Electoral College was necessary to protect against potential abuses of power by the president. And second, they didn't want the president to be elected directly by the people because they worried that such a system would turn into a popularity contest. Instead, the framers reasoned that by having electors formally cast their ballots for president, they would be able to choose someone qualified to run the country rather than simply the person who was the most popular. And as it turned out, this compromise was acceptable to most of the framers, and eventually became the foundation of the presidency. But it did leave some things to be resolved. First, how much power should the president have? Second, how would electors be chosen? And third, how long would the president serve? And in order to address these issues, the framers got to work drawing up the details. First, when it came to presidential powers, the framers ultimately decided to grant the president significant authority, largely because they realized that whoever occupied the office would need a certain amount of independence from the legislature in order to effectively manage the country. For instance, the framers gave the president the power to veto legislation passed by Congress, to appoint judges to the Supreme Court and other federal courts, and to negotiate treaties with foreign governments. In addition, the framers also gave the president the power to issue pardons and reprieves, to command the military, and to make sure that the laws were faithfully executed. And in order to prevent the president from becoming too powerful, the framers made the president accountable to the people through elections. In fact, they designed the Electoral College so that the president would have to worry about winning over voters in every state in order to secure enough electoral votes. This would ensure that the president wouldn't simply pander to one particular group of people, but instead would have to try to appeal to a broad cross-section of Americans. As for how electors would be chosen, the framers didn't explicitly say in the Constitution, leaving it up to the states to decide how their electors would be chosen. But they did set up some basic guidelines. First, the number of electors a state would have would be equal to its number of representatives in Congress. Second, each elector would have to cast 2 votes, and the candidate who received the most votes would become president, and the candidate who received the second highest number of votes would become vice president. Finally, the framers had to decide how long the president would serve, and after much debate, they settled on 4 years. This was important because it provided a stable term in office that would allow the president to plan ahead and make long-term decisions in the best interest of the country. And there you have it. In just a few short weeks, the framers had created the presidency. But in order to learn more about how the presidency has evolved over time, check out Crash Course U.S. History. I'm the host of this channel in Crash Course U.S. History, and I'd like to thank our patrons for making these videos possible. Shout out to Emily and the team at MCN for helping us launch this channel, and a big thank you to the National Endowment for the Humanities for supporting this series through a grant. If you want to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever, you can join our community on Patreon. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into a concept that's absolutely fundamental to understanding American government. And frankly, it's a brilliant piece of political engineering. We're talking about Chapter 10. Checks and balances. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Government stuff. Isn't that kind of dry? But stick with me, because this is the story of how the founders of the United States tried to build a government that was powerful enough to work, but not so powerful that it could become a danger to the people it was meant to serve. So, let's set the stage. Picture the late 1700s. The American colonists had just fought a revolution to break free from what they saw as the tyranny of a king, a monarch who held way too much power. When it came time to design their own government, their number one fear was creating another tyrant. They were terrified of concentrating too much authority in one person or one group. That fear, that deep-seated desire to avoid a repeat of history, is the driving force behind the entire structure of the U.S. Constitution. The big idea they came up with is called the separation of powers. It's a simple yet profound concept. Instead of one entity holding all the governmental power, they decided to split it into 3 distinct branches. Think of it like a 3-legged stool. You need all 3 legs to be separate and strong for the stool to be stable. If one leg is too long or too weak, the whole thing topples over. These 3 branches are the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. Each one has its own specific job, its own unique domain of power. First up, we have the legislative branch, which is Congress. Congress is made up of 2 parts: the House of Representatives and the Senate. Their primary, most important job is to make the laws. They are the voice of the people, debating issues and writing the rules that govern the nation. If you think about any federal law, from taxes to environmental protection, its journey started in the halls of Congress. Next, we have the executive branch, headed by the President of the United States. The President's main role is to enforce the laws. So, after Congress passes a law, it's the President's job, along with the vast network of federal agencies and departments, to make sure that law is carried out. The President is also the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and the nation's chief diplomat. They are the face of the nation on the world stage, and the CEO in a sense, of the federal government. And finally, we have the judicial branch, which is the court system. At the very top is the Supreme Court, and below it are the lower federal courts. Their job is to interpret the laws. This is crucial. When there's a disagreement about what a law actually means, or whether a law is even fair and constitutional, the courts are the ones who make the final call. They act as the referees, ensuring that the laws are applied fairly and that they do violate the fundamental principles laid out in the Constitution. So, you have Congress making the laws, the President enforcing the laws, and the courts interpreting the laws. Separation of powers. Sounds neat and tidy, right? But the founders were smart. They knew that just separating the powers wasn't enough. What was to stop one branch from slowly growing more powerful and starting to overshadow the others? What if Congress started passing oppressive laws, or the President started acting like a king? This is where the true genius of the system comes into play. The system of checks and balances. This isn't just about separating powers. It is about giving each branch specific tools to check or limit the power of the other two. It's designed to create a healthy tension, a state of constant negotiation and compromise, forcing the branches to work together. It's like a complex game of rock, paper, scissors, where each branch has a way to counter the others. Let's look at some concrete examples of how this works. Congress, the legislative branch, has the power to make laws. But that law doesn't just automatically happen. After Congress passes a bill, it has to go to the President's desk. The President, the head of the executive branch, can check Congress's power by vetoing that bill. A veto is basically the President saying, "Nope, I don't agree with this law." But wait, the checks don't stop there. Does a presidential veto mean the bill is dead forever? Not necessarily. Congress has a check on the President's veto power. If a president vetoes a bill, Congress can vote to override that veto. It is difficult to do it, requires a 2/3 majority vote in both the House and the Senate, but it is a powerful tool that ensures the president can just single-handedly block the will of the legislature. This is a perfect example of that back and forth, that balance. Let's talk about another check the president has on the judiciary. The president has the power to nominate federal judges, including the justices of the Supreme Court. These are lifetime appointments, so this is a huge deal. It allows a president to shape the direction of the judiciary for decades to come. However, that power isn't absolute. The president can't just pick a friend and put them on the Supreme Court. Every single nominee must be confirmed by the Senate. The Senate holds hearings, questions the nominee, and then votes. This is a crucial check by the legislative branch on both the executive and judicial branches. It prevents the president from stacking the courts with unqualified or extreme individuals. And how does the judicial branch check the other two? This is arguably one of the most powerful checks of all. The power of judicial review. This means the court, and ultimately the Supreme Court, can declare a law passed by Congress and signed by the President to be unconstitutional. If the Supreme Court decides a law violates the rights and principles in the Constitution, that law becomes void. It's nullified. This is a massive check on the power of the legislature and the executive. It ensures that no matter how popular a law might be, it cannot violate the fundamental law of the land. Furthermore, the Supreme Court can also declare actions taken by the President or the executive branch to be unconstitutional. This ensures that the President, despite being the most powerful individual in the government, is still subject to the rule of law. They are not above the Constitution. The system is a web of interconnected limitations. Congress controls the money, the power of the purse. They have to approve the government's budget, which is a significant check on the President, who can't spend money that Congress hasn't appropriated. The President is the commander-in-chief, but only Congress can officially declare war. The President negotiates treaties with other countries, but the Senate must ratify them for them to take effect. The House of Representatives has the power to impeach or formally accuse a president, federal judge, or other official of wrongdoing. The Senate then holds the trial to decide whether to remove that person from office. This is the ultimate check on abuse of power. This intricate dance is what the founders intended. They didn't want a government that was super efficient and fast. In fact, they deliberately designed it to be slow and They wanted to force debate, encourage compromise, and make it difficult for any one faction or idea to steamroll the entire country. The friction, the gridlock we sometimes complain about, is not a flaw in the system. In many ways, it's a feature. It's the sound of checks and balances at work, preventing rash decisions and protecting against the concentration of power. So, to recap this monumental idea, to prevent tyranny, the founders separated the powers of government into three branches: the Legislative Congress, the Executive, President, and the Judicial Courts. But to make sure no single branch could become a tyrant on its own, they gave each branch specific powers to check and balance the others. This creates a system of shared power and accountability. It's a framework built on a healthy dose of skepticism about power, and it's the bedrock that has supported American democracy through all its challenges for over 2 centuries. It's a constant, ongoing process, not a perfect machine, but a dynamic system designed to protect liberty. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into checks and balances. I hope this made the concept a little clearer and more interesting. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and do you won't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Okay, it's time to get 'em brain cows milked, because it's Chapter 11 of the AP-Gov, Road to 1877. And this chapter is struggles over commerce and trade. So let's get it. Okay, so to set the stage for this chapter, we need to know that there were fundamental differences between the North and South, economically speaking. The industrial and commercial interests of the North did not want the federal government to be involved in regulating trade and commerce. Like if you're an industrialist or a factory owner, you don't want Uncle Sam breathing down your neck telling you how to run your business. Whereas the agricultural interests of the South, especially those involved in exporting crops like cotton, relied heavily on the federal government to regulate interstate commerce in order to protect their investments. And that's because the South was way more invested in shipping their goods across state lines than the North was. In fact, most of the South's exports went to Europe, which makes sense if you look at a map. We are the North. Europe is over there. Whoa! Look at that! There's water! What do we have here? An ocean. Oh my. Okay, that's probably why they're shipping stuff over there. So, since these two regions had such different economic interests regarding interstate commerce, how in the world could they possibly come to any kind of compromise on this issue? Well, as always, let's turn to our favorite table-turning, rule-making founding father, Mr. Roger Sherman, who was from Connecticut, which, by the way, was a slave state. But don't go thinking he cared about protecting slavery in his proposal for regulating commerce. It was all about keeping the peace between the states. So what Sherman proposed was that the federal Congress could regulate and even prohibit certain kinds of trade and commerce, but only with the consent of 2/3 of both houses of Congress. Meaning what? That any regulation or prohibition of trade would require a supermajority. Why? Well, this was meant to protect the interests of smaller states against the interests of larger states. See, bigger states like bigger representation in Congress, which meant that smaller states would get drowned out if bigger states wanted to regulate something that the smaller states didn't like. So, to protect those smaller states, Sherman proposed that any regulation of commerce would require a supermajority, and that little OL clause ended up being the basis for the 3/5 THS compromise in the Constitution. Now, after the Constitution was ratified, this issue of regulating interstate commerce kind of faded into the background, at least for a while. And the reason it faded into the background is because the nation was focused on, surviving, creating a functional government, fighting a war, the usual. And beside it turns out that regulating interstate commerce was unreally necessary because the majority of trade occurred within state borders. But once the economy began to expand beyond those state borders, people started calling for Congress to address the issue. In 1792, for example, Congress passed a law that put a tariff on all British manufactured goods coming into the United States. And the purpose of that law was to protect American manufacturers from foreign competition. But Southerners were untoo happy about it because they sold a lot of British manufactured goods in the southern states. and so they began calling for the restriction of Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. But this issue got put on the back burner again when the first party system came along, because both parties kind of just ignored it. Both parties had other issues to fight about, like, I don't know, the national bank, the national debt, the purchase of Louisiana. So regulating interstate commerce was like, who cares? But once the second party system came along, the issue came back onto the front burner, because now you had two distinct regions with two distinct interests. The North wanted to keep regulating commerce to protect their industries, but the South wanted to limit the power of Congress to regulate commerce because it interfered with their export business. And so the issue finally came to a head with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And the nullification crisis of 1832 before that. The Compromise of 1850. No, none of the above. It was actually the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Let me explain. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which opened up the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to white settlement. And what that meant was that slavery would be decided by popular sovereignty, meaning that the residents of these territories would vote to decide whether or not to allow slavery. But this was a problem for the South, because even though the Missouri Compromise had prohibited slavery north of the 36 degrees north latitude line, the admission of Kansas and Nebraska threatened to bring slavery into areas where it had been prohibited. And so Southerners began arguing that the federal Congress had no right to regulate slavery in the territories, because doing so infringed upon states' rights. And this argument reached a fever pitch when Nebraska voted to become a slave state. And then, whoa, wait a minute. Did I just see a bunch of senators running away? Yeah, you did, because this was the sequence of events that led to the formation of the Confederacy. But the last thing we need to consider in this video is the Dred Scott decision handed down by the Supreme Court in 1857. Remember him? Yeah, the guy who tried to sue for his freedom after living on free soil. Yeah, that guy. Anyway, Dred Scott argued that, since he had lived on free soil, therefore he should be a free man. But Chief Justice Royer B. Taney said, nope, no way, amigo. In fact, according to Tony, Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. Therefore, Southerners could take their slaves anywhere they pleased. And as you can imagine, this decision made Southerners feel even better about their argument that the federal Congress had no right to regulate slavery. But despite this very favorable Supreme Court decision, Southerners weren't completely satisfied. Why not? Well, let me tell you, it's time for a little bit of extra help. I'm not talking about extra help in the form of tutoring, although that is a great service. No, what I'm talking about is extra help in the form of a review packet, and that's exactly what you get with the review packet from my website. I've taken everything that is in my videos and condensed it into one nice downloadable packet that includes graphic organizers, timelines, maps, and charts. And if that's not enough, I've also included 100 vocabulary words that you need to know in order to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. Plus, I am adding new things all the time, like extra review packets for individual chapters, and mini review packets for multiple chapters. So if you need a little extra help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then head on over to my website and grab the review packet today. And now back to Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. So with all of that tension building in the background, let's return to the topic at hand, which was regulating trade. Because, as the years went on, Southerners became increasingly vocal about restricting Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. And that culminated in the passage of the Force Bill in 1833, which allowed the president to use military force to collect tariffs in states that didn't want to pay them. And even though this law was meant to be used in South Carolina after they nullified those tariffs, it was never used. The mere existence of this law showed how divided the country was becoming over the issue of regulating commerce. And this conflict came to a head in 1857 when Congress passed the Ostend Manifesto. This was a secret document written by 3 pro-slavery expansionists who argued that the United States should purchase Cuba from Spain, even though Spain had repeatedly said they weren't interested in selling. And even though this manifesto had nothing to do with regulating interstate commerce, Southerners saw it as another example of Northern aggression, and so they blocked its release to the public. But when Southerners blocked its release to the public, that meant that the document had to be leaked to the press, which caused an uproar in the North. The New York Tribune published the document and called on Congress to annex Cuba. which caused Southerners to accuse the New York Tribune of interfering in the domestic affairs of the Southern states. And so what happened next? Well, it seems that the only reasonable thing to do would be to burn down the entire city of New York, right? But before anyone could suggest such a reasonable solution, a group of 7 gentlemen met together in secret to try to resolve this issue. And what you've probably already guessed. Yes, these 7 gentlemen were part of the Ostend Manifesto. They represented 3 border states, Delaware, Maryland, and Missouri, plus 4 slave states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina. And they wanted to find a compromise between the North and the South regarding the issue of regulating commerce. And the compromise they came up with was, drumroll please, the Corwin-Crittenden Compromise of 1857. And the best way to describe this compromise is to just read it straight from the textbook. The agreement stipulated that Congress could regulate interstate commerce with the proviso that no such regulation would interfere with the institution of slavery as it existed in the states. This meant that the federal government could not interfere with slavery in the territories and could not interfere with the shipment of slaves into or out of the United States until 1860. And to top it off, Congress pledged to pass an amendment to the Constitution forbidding any future ban on the importation of slaves. Okay, so this sounds like a pretty sweet deal for the South. But how did it benefit the North? Well, to be honest, it didn't. But as the author of the textbook puts it, the North had no interest in compromising on the issue of slavery, and the South had no interest in compromising on anything else. So basically, this was as good of a compromise as they were going to get. And that's why this compromise lasted until the secession crisis in 1860, at which point the South decided that it wasn't so keen on compromise anymore. Okay, that's what you need to know about Chapter 11, Struggles over Commerce and Trade. If you want even more help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then click right over here in the review packet. And I've got a super helpful video on the next page that will show you exactly what you need to do to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. I'll see you over there. It's time for Chapter 12, Writing It All Down. The Committee of Detail worked through the draft, making changes to the structure, organization, style, and tone of the document. The Committee of Style refined the language even further. And after much discussion, compromise, and debate, they turned their work over to a member of the committee who was chosen to write out the final version in elegant and persuasive wording. That person was Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris rewrote large sections of the document and polished the prose until it shone. His writing was precise and elegant, and he had an ear for how words sounded when they were spoken aloud. He is also responsible for some of the most famous lines in the entire document. As you read this chapter, look for the following. How did the delegates go from rough draft to a finished product? What compromises did they make in writing the final draft? And what does this tell us about their priorities? Let's dive in. As the convention of 1787 drew to a close, the assembled delegates had the daunting task of turning the rough draft of the Constitution into a finished product. To do that, they created 2 committees, the Committee of Detail and the Committee of Style. The Committee of Detail, made up of 3 delegates, Gouverneur Morris of New York, James Madison of Virginia, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, had the job of revising the articles and sections of the proposed Constitution. They were tasked with smoothing out inconsistencies in the plan, resolving some of the issues raised during the debate over the previous drafts, and clarifying vague or ambiguous phrases. After they finished their work, the Committee of Detail would then turn the draft over to the Committee of Style, which consisted of Maurice Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania and Robert Morris of Pennsylvania, whose responsibility it was to polish the prose. Their goal was to make the document as clear and elegant as possible. So now we have Gouverneur Maurice on both committees, and he will play a pivotal role in shaping the final draft. Gouverneur Morris was a delegate from New York. While he was not a household name among the delegates at the convention, he was well respected by his fellow delegates, and though he didn't speak much at the convention, when he did, people listened. Like many of the other delegates, Maurice was a man of property, owning slaves and large tracts of land. But unlike many of the others, he was self-made. When he was 14 years old, he ran away from home to escape an arranged marriage. On his own, he eventually made a career in law and politics. He became wealthy as a lawyer and later as a speculator in Western lands. This combination of personal drive and material success made him popular with the delegates, In fact, he was considered one of the best writers among them, so it is no surprise that he was asked to take the lead on writing the final draft. When the Committee of Detail first met to consider the draft, Madison presented a revised plan that reorganized the structure of the government. Instead of having the executive branch appointed by and dependent on the legislature, as it had been in the previous draft, he moved the selection of the president to the Electoral College, thus separating the executive and legislative branches. Additionally, Madison clarified the powers of the legislative branch, explaining that Congress would have the power to declare war, to raise and support armies, and to appoint committees to oversee the business of the government. Finally, he suggested some changes to the representation in the legislature, arguing that the number of representatives for each state should be based on population. Now, these changes had to be approved by the larger body, and as they were debated, it fell to Maurice to find compromises and smooth out the language. One of the more contentious issues before the Committee of Detail was the method by which representatives would be apportioned in the legislature. Large states like Virginia and Pennsylvania wanted representation to be based on population, while smaller states like New Jersey and Delaware argued against it, fearing that their interests would be overwhelmed by the larger states. Now, there was no way that the delegates were going to agree on representation right away, but they needed to get something into the Constitution so that they could move on to the next issue. So Governor Maurice found a way to get everyone to agree to disagree. He drafted the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, which proposed that representation in the lower house would be based on population and that every state would receive equal representation in the upper house. The Committee of Detail agreed to this compromise, and the full body accepted it on July 16th. This cleared the way for the committee to continue its work. But now there was a snag. The committee couldn't seem to agree on the wording for the section that outlined how representatives would be After struggling with the wording for days, Governor Maurice finally came up with the elegant solution. In Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, you can read the following. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be admitted into the Union in the following manner. And then he goes on to describe the apportionment by using the future tense in the phrase, shall be admitted into the Union. Maurice avoided the issue of how representation would be apportioned in the future. In effect, he punted on the issue, pushing the question off until another day. Since the point of the Committee of Detail was to get the convention moving again, Maurice decided that sometimes you just have to punt in order to keep the game going. As the Committee of Detail continued its work, Governor Maurice found himself playing a critical role in mediating disputes and drafting compromises. For example, he helped resolve the disagreement over whether the executive branch would be allowed to remove judges from office. The convention ultimately compromised on a system of judicial review in which the court acted as the final arbiter of the constitutionality of laws passed by Congress. Another issue before the committee was the method of electing the president. Maurice helped craft the 12th Amendment, which required the president and vice president to be elected separately. These are just a few examples of Maurice's contributions to the committee. He drafted compromises and resolutions that allowed the convention to push forward and resolve the most contentious issues. Now, once the Committee of Detail finished their work, the draft went to the Committee of Style. And here Maurice really shined. He took the draft, already polished by the Committee of Detail, and polished it some more. His work resulted in precise, elegant, and stirring prose, and he was particularly sensitive to how the words sounded when spoken aloud. Take, for example, the famous opening of the United States Constitution, which reads, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Maurice wrote this preamble with great care. First, he chose the word "we" to emphasize that the government draws its power from the people. He then listed the goals of the new government, such as establishing justice and promoting the general welfare. Finally, he ended the sentence with a stirring flourish, declaring that the Constitution would secure the blessings of liberty for the American people and their posterity. And here is where Maurice's skill as a writer truly shines. You see, although we read the preamble as one sentence today, in the 18th century, the sentence could end midline. In fact, the original draft of the Constitution contained more than a dozen sentences that ran on for several lines. Using modern punctuation, Maurice broke the sentences into much shorter lines, which made the preamble easier to read and remember. Additionally, Maurice added the word "our" before posterity to create a sense of connection between the present and future generations. This small change transformed the preamble from a dry statement of principles into a stirring call to action. In doing so, he emphasized the purpose of the new government, which was to secure the blessings of liberty for all Americans, both present and future. By the time the Committee of Style finished their work, the draft was ready to be presented to the convention, and on September 17th, the delegates voted to approve it. Now Gouverneur Maurice had succeeded in his difficult task of writing the final draft of the Constitution. Through his elegant prose, he had taken a rough and rambling document and turned it into a concise and stirring statement of principles. His contributions to the Committee of Detail and the Committee of Style were essential to the success of the Constitutional Convention. Without his help, it is unlikely that the delegates would have been able to craft the compromises necessary to forge a new constitution for the United States. In the next and final chapter of this series, we will see how the delegates reacted to the finished draft. Some loved Italiano. Others hated it. But everyone agreed that the final draft was a masterpiece of political science and one of the greatest governing documents ever written. Join me next time for Chapter 13, signing it all off. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to learn more about the fascinating history of the United States, stay tuned for more content. And if you want to watch more of my videos, you can do so here. Thanks for watching. Alright, get those pens ready, class, because we're going to sign that Constitution. So, yep, this is Chapter 13. And if you're just tuning in, then welcome to my class, where we are going to learn about the amazing story of the United States. Now, in Chapter 12, we talked about how the Constitutional Convention was one big compromise after another, and it was all about representation and taxes and counting slaves and how to make everybody happy. But at the end of that chapter, I told you that they finally finished and they had a constitution. And now we're going to talk about how they got it signed. So let's head back to Philadelphia and finish up this amazing story. So here they are on September 17th, 1787, and they have just finished up their work. Now, there were actually 55 delegates at this Constitutional Convention, but not all of them stayed for the entire thing. So really, the most important question is who did sign this thing? Well, 39 of the delegates did. They represented 12 of the states. The only ones missing were New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island. We'll come back to them in a minute. But for now, let's focus on these 39 people. It was a pretty big deal to sign this Constitution. I mean, they were signing away their power. And, you know, some of these guys were like, wait, I don't want to do this. But eventually, they all did. And when they were done, George Washington stood up and said, "You will know what? This is a big deal. This is one of the greatest things ever." He said, "Let's have a party." And they did. They celebrated with a big dinner. Now, during the dinner, George Washington asked Benjamin Franklin to say a prayer. And he prayed, "Almighty God, we have seen the birth of this nation in the course of a few months. We have traced the progress of its infant year and have watched the growth of its early institutions. We now behold it in the maturity of its form and the pledge of its prosperity. Grant, we beseech thee, that the system of government, which we have established under thy blessings, may be among the most prosperous that ever this world has known." So, yeah, even though the Constitution didn't include a national religion, these guys were still pretty religious. Anyway, old Ben Franklin, being the elder statesman that he was, also gave a toast, and he said, "Friends, I confess I have in my time been pretty well acquainted with almost all the plans that have been offered for the government of our new state. I have read more books on the subject than I can now remember. The plan which has been adopted is the best I have ever seen." Then he gave the famous toast, "May the Rhodesia of the Convention live forever." Yep, it's true. Ben Franklin loved that toast so much that he repeated it 2 nights later, along with many other toasts, including one to the pure and unadulterated Merlot of the President of the Convention. Now, by that, he meant George Washington, of course. Yeah, he wasn't referring to any particular bottle of wine. But not everyone was so excited about the Constitution. In fact, a group of 9 men refused to sign it, and they became known as the The main reason that they refused to sign was that it didn't have a Bill of Rights, and they wanted the people to have some protections against the federal government. But the Federalists, on the other hand, they said, hey, this is better than the Articles. You don't need a Bill of Rights. And besides, the states already have rights, and the people have rights. What more do you want? Oh, and by the way, that whole Anti-Federalist argument was used to keep some states from joining. Yep, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island were not feeling that Constitution love. In fact, Rhode Island didn't join until 1790, and that was only after the Bill of Rights was added. Meanwhile, Patrick Henry was pacing the floor in Virginia like a caged tiger, waiting for the Constitution to be ratified. And he says, a famous line, "Give me liberty or give me death." And yet he didn't sign it either. And that's because he left the convention before it was over. Why? Well, he was mad that they were compromising. You see, he wanted to make sure that the central government would be weak. That's why he's considered an anti- But he didn't stay around to sign it. He went home. He wasn't even in Philadelphia when they finished. So there's your answer. Yes, Virginia. There are many reasons why Patrick Henry did not sign the Constitution. And if you think that's confusing, well, that's nothing compared to the arguments that scholars have about whether or not James Madison really wrote the Constitution. Because yes, that's a real thing. Yep, there are people who say that someone else wrote it. Okay, so now we have to talk about ratification. So the Constitution couldn't go into effect until at least 9 states ratified it. And at first it looked like that might be a problem because there was a lot of debate. I mean, the Federalists wanted it. They thought it was great. The Anti-Federalists said no way. But as it turns out, the Federalists won. And by the end of 1788, 9 states had ratified it, and it went into effect. All right, so now let's go to the very first words that were written in the Constitution. It was "we, the people." And that is a big deal, because it begins with a word that is singular, but it means all of us together. And that's exactly what the Constitution is. It is all of us together agreeing to be a country. And what does that mean? It means that the people are the source of all political power. The people hold all the cards. And if you've been watching this series, then you should not be surprised to hear that. After all, the Declaration of Independence said all men are created equal. And now the Constitution is saying that all of us, the people, are the source of political power. That's the foundation of this country. And to help explain it, we're gonna use a diagram. Okay, so here's the people, and they are the source of all political power. Then they delegate some of that power to the government. They elect their leaders, and then the government makes laws, and they protect the people. See, this is a great system. You have the people and the government working together. But wait, I hear someone asking, what if the people and the government start fighting each other? Who wins? Well, the answer is both. The point is to balance the power between the two. If one gets too powerful, then the other one can rein them in. Now, the main purpose of the Constitution was to fix the problems of the Articles of Confederation. And we've talked about that quite a bit. And you should remember that the major problem with the Articles was that the central government didn't have enough power. I mean, it was almost non-existent. Congress couldn't raise money or an army. And as soon as trouble came along, poof, the central government just disappeared. But with the Constitution, they fixed that. The central government was given a lot more power. Meanwhile, the Anti-Federalists, they weren't worried about that happening. They were worried about the central government getting too much power. But as it turns out, history has shown us that they were wrong. In fact, today, most people agree that the central government does have too much power. Now, when writing the Constitution, the biggest problem was deciding how to count people. Should every person count the same? Should slaves count? How about women? And in the end, they compromised. See, they couldn't decide how to count slaves, so they decided that 3/5 of every slave would be counted for representation and taxes. And, that was a compromise. At the time, some people wanted every slave to be counted. Others wanted none. So 3/5 was a compromise. Oh, and by the way, women and Native Americans were not counted at all. Now, I know that sounds terrible, and it is. But the truth is that white male property owners were the only ones that got to vote anyway. And if you want to hear about the struggle to get everyone counted equally, then that will be part of our story in Chapter 41. Okay, so that was the big constitutional convention. Do you want more details? Well, if you want more details, click right here in the extra content. There is a bunch of videos that will tell you everything that you ever wanted to know about this amazing story. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through American history. Last time, we left our founding fathers in Philadelphia, having just completed a monumental task, drafting the United States Constitution. But signing the document was just the beginning. The real battle, the intellectual and political war for the future of the nation, was about to begin. This is the story of the battle for ratification. Imagine the scene. It's September 1787. The proposed Constitution is sent out from the quiet, sequestered convention hall to the bustling, noisy, and deeply divided 13 states. It wasn't a done deal. Far from it. This new framework for government needed to be approved or ratified by at least 9 of the 13 states to become the law of the land. And let me tell you, people had strong opinions. Almost immediately, the country split into 2 opposing camps. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Think of it as of the nation's first great political debate. The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Adams, were the champions of the new Constitution. They believed a strong, centralized federal government was absolutely essential for the nation's survival. They'd seen the chaos under the Articles of Confederation, where a weak central government couldn't manage the economy, defend the borders, or even put down internal rebellions like Shays' Rebellion. For them, the Constitution was the answer, a blueprint for a stable, prosperous, and respected nation. They argued that it created a government powerful enough to be effective, but with enough checks and balances like the separation of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches to prevent tyranny. On the other side of the aisle were this group included passionate patriots like Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Samuel Adams. These weren't men who were against America. They were against this specific plan for America. Their biggest fear, that this new powerful federal government would become just like the British monarchy they had just fought a revolution to escape. They saw the presidency as a potential king, Congress as a new aristocracy, and the national government as a distant, power-hungry entity that would swallow up as rights and the authority of the individual states. They looked at the Constitution and asked, where are our protections? Where is the guarantee of our liberties? The debate raged in newspapers, pamphlets, taverns, and town squares across the country. It was a war of words. And the most brilliant arguments came from a series of 85 essays published in New York newspapers. We know them today as the Federalist Papers, written yali under the pseudonym Publius. These essays were the work of 3 intellectual giants. Alexander Hamilton, who wrote the majority, James Madison, who contributed some of the most famous ones, and John Hay, who wrote a few before falling ill. The Federalist Papers were a masterclass in political persuasion. They broke down the Constitution yali, piece by piece, explaining the logic and aha moment behind every clause. Hamilton, with his characteristic energy, argued for a strong executive and a robust national economy. Madison, in essays like Federalists Know. 10. Brilliantly tackled the problem of factions or what we might call political parties or special interest groups. He argued that a large, diverse republic was actually the best way to control them, because no single group could easily dominate the others. In Federalists Know. 51, he famously wrote, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. He explained how the Constitution's system of checks and balances used human ambition to counteract ambition, creating a government that could control the governed, and then, crucially, control itself. The Federalist Papers weren't just propaganda. They were a profound and detailed defense of the principles of American government, and they're still studied junju today by lawyers, judges, and scholars. But the Anti-Federalists had a powerful, resonant argument that the Federalists initially struggled to counter. It was a simple, terrifying question. Where is the Bill of Rights? The original Constitution didn't include one. The drafters, like Hamilton, argued that it was unnecessary and even dangerous. They believed the Constitution already limited the government to its specific, enumerated powers. If a power wasn't listed, the government didn't have it. So, why list a bunch of rights the government couldn't violate anyway? Hamilton worried that listing some rights might imply that any rights not asterisk listed, weren't protected. The Anti-Federalists' Yali Esaha moment was to see this was a good enough answer for the American people. They had just fought a war for the rights. They wanted them written down, black and white, as a permanent shield against government overreach. Men like George Mason had refused to sign the Constitution in Philadelphia, precisely because it lacked a Bill of Rights. Patrick Henry thundered in the Virginia ratifying convention, demanding to know why the document began with "we the people" instead of "we the states," fearing it signaled the end of state sovereignty and individual liberty. This demand for a Bill of Rights became the central issue of the ratification debate. In state after state, the vote was razor. In Massachusetts, a compromise was struck. The delegates agreed to ratify the Constitution, but on the condition that they could recommend amendments to be added later, including a Bill of Rights. This ratify now. Amend later strategy became the key to victory for the Federalists. The momentum started to build. Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey ratified quickly, but the real tests were in the large, powerful states of Virginia and New York. Without their approval, the new union would be fractured and weak. In Virginia, the debate was a clash of titans. Patrick Henry against James Madison. Henry's powerful oratory skills were legendary, but Madison's calm, logical, and well-reasoned arguments, backed by the promise of a future Bill of Rights, narrowly won the day. Virginia ratified in June 1788. All eyes then turned to New York, where Alexander Hamilton was leading the Federalist charge against a strong Anti-Federalist opposition. The news of Virginia's ratification, along with New Hampshire becoming the critical 9th state to ratify, put immense pressure on New York. Finally, by a slim margin of just 3 votes, New York also approved the Constitution. The battle was essentially won. True to their word, one of the first acts of the new Congress in 1789 was to debate a series of amendments. James Madison, once skeptical of a Bill of Rights, now became its champion in Congress, drafting the proposals himself to ensure they were well. He sifted through of suggestions from the state conventions, distilling them into 12 proposed amendments. 10 of them were ratified by the states, and in 1791, they officially became the Bill of Rights. These first 10 amendments guaranteed the fundamental freedoms that the Anti-Federalists had fought so hard to protect: freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches and seizures, and the right to a fair trial, among others. The 10th Amendment addressed the core Anti-Federalist fear, stating that any powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved for the states or the people. In the end, the battle for ratification wasn't a victory junju for one side over the other. It was a compromise, a synthesis. The Federalists got their strong, centralized government, capable of leading a nation. The Anti-Federalists, even in defeat, gave the nation its soul the Bill of Rights, a permanent testament to the importance of individual liberty. This grueling, year-long debate forged a final form of American government and proved that in this new republic, the people's voice, their arguments, and their demands mattered. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of our nation is full of these incredible moments of debate and decision. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue the journey, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode. We'll see you next time. Okay, so this is Chapter 15, The Constitution's Enduring Legacy. And now, if you're ready to test your knowledge about this chapter, I've got 2 options for you. You can either go to my website, click on the link below, or just scan this QR code and that will take you to the review packet, which has got everything that you need to get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. But if you want to do it the hard way, keep watching this video. Alright, here are the key terms, and if you know these, you'll be good to go. So let us begin with the end of the beginning, because that is really what this chapter is about. It's the end of the beginning of the United States. The Articles of Confederation is no longer the governing document. we have a new Constitution. And so we gonna talk about how the Constitution has endured and how it continues to shape our lives today. So first off, when was this Constitution ratified? In 1788. And then when did it actually go into effect? 1789. Why the difference? Well, the Bill of Rights had to be added first. Okay, so remember, we ended the last chapter with delegates at the Constitutional Convention hammering out the framework of a new national government, but it was uncompleted. They didn't finish their work there. Instead, they sent it to the states for ratification, and then while they were waiting for the states to come, back in yea or nay, the framers added the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And then once that was done and ratified, then the Constitution began its life as the supreme law of the land. But the big question is, how has the Constitution endured? How is it that something written in 1787, 1789, is still the governing document of the United States today? Well, the answer is twofold. First of all, the Constitution established a strong central government, and that appealed to the big states. Let us not forget that under the Articles of Confederation, it was the big states like Virginia and New York who felt the most frustrated because their interests were being drowned out by the small states. But with the new Constitution and the Great Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise and all those compromises that they worked out, the large states said, yes, this is definitely better than what we had under the Articles. But second, and this is really the big part, the Constitution established a stable foundation for settling disputes over slavery. Now, the framers knew that this issue of slavery was going to continue to cause problems for the United States. So in order to settle that issue temporarily, they passed these compromises. The Three-Fifths Compromise and the Great Compromise, which basically gave the South what they wanted in order to get them to agree to ratify the Constitution. And what was that? The Three-Fifths Compromise dealt with representation in Congress. Southern states were allowed to count 3/5 of their slave population in determining representation. And then the Great Compromise resolved the dispute between the big states and the small states about representation. And it did so by creating a bicameral legislature where the Senate would represent the states equally, and then the House of Representatives would be based on population. So again, two compromises that appeased the southern states and the big states and the small states, and as a result, they were able to ratify the Constitution and move forward. Okay, so we've answered the first part of the enduring legacy question. The Constitution established a strong central government, and it settled the dispute over slavery. But what about now? How does it continue to guide the nation today? Well, let's begin with the principle of judicial review, which was established in the landmark Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison in 1803. This case established the idea that the Supreme Court could declare laws unconstitutional and therefore void, and that decision ushered in the concept of the court as the final arbiter in all matters involving the Constitution. Okay, now another way that the Constitution continues to shape our lives is through the process of amendment. There are only 27 amendments to the Constitution, and that tells you something about the amending process. It's difficult to amend the Constitution, but that difficulty ensures that any change to the Constitution will be carefully considered and widely accepted, so we don't amend the Constitution on a whim. In fact, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were added to the Constitution in response to criticism that the new Constitution contained no explicit guarantees of individual rights. And then the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote, was the first amendment added in over 100 years. Why the pause? Well, again, it's just very difficult to amend the Constitution. It requires a 2/3 vote by both houses of Congress, and then a 3/4 vote by the states. But despite the difficulty, the Constitution has been amended 27 times, which demonstrates its flexibility and its capacity to grow and adapt while preserving its fundamental principles. Now, the third way that the Constitution endures is through the process of interpretation. As society changes and new issues arise, the Supreme Court must rule on whether the Constitution's framers would have anticipated the issue at hand and how they might have resolved it. So, for example, in the landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now, this decision overturned the precedent set in an earlier case, Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which had established the separate but equal doctrine. So why is this an example of interpretation? Well, the framers of the Constitution didn't specifically address school segregation. That wasn't even on their radar. They didn't think about that issue. But once the issue arose and made its way to the Supreme Court, the Justices had to interpret the Constitution and decide how the framers would have handled it. And ultimately they decided that the framers would not have anticipated this issue. But if they had been confronted with it, they would have ruled that separate facilities violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So that's an example of interpretation. The justices looked at the Constitution and said, how would the framers have handled this? Okay, the fourth way that the Constitution endures is through the process of political socialization. So let's talk about that. The Constitution is taught in schools. It's a required part of the curriculum. And from an early age, citizens learn about the Constitution and its principles, which helps to ensure that it remains a living document in the hearts and minds of Americans. And the fifth way that the Constitution endures is through civic engagement. Groups, organizations, political parties, interest groups, all sorts of folks engage in activities that promote civic virtue and encourage citizens to participate in the political process, which helps to ensure that the Constitution continues to shape our lives today. But finally, let's talk about how the Constitution continues to pose challenges. And yes, I know that sounds kind of odd, but hear me out. First of all, the original Constitution made no explicit guarantees of individual rights. And while that issue was eventually resolved with the addition of the Bill of Rights, the struggle over individual rights continues to this day. For example, the Second Amendment's protection of the right to bear arms is being hotly debated in the wake of mass shootings across the country. Same thing with the First Amendment and the debate over campaign financing and the Citizens United case. Then second, the framers also failed to address the issue of slavery in a way that would lead to its ultimate abolition. And while the 13th Amendment had outlawed slavery, the legacy of slavery continues to haunt the United States. And yes, that's evident in the ongoing struggle for racial equality and the debate over reparations. And then third, the Constitution's framers also failed to anticipate the role that the federal government would play in the lives of American citizens. Back in their day, the federal government was very limited in scope. But today, the federal government is deeply involved in almost every aspect of our lives, and that raises all sorts of questions about the balance of power between the federal government and the states and the people. Okay, that's what you need to know about Chapter 15. I've got videos right here on all the other chapters if you need them. And again, if you want the review packet, check the description for the link, or just scan that QR code and it'll take you right there. Alright, I'm out.